In this video, we'll be talking about file management for music production. Hi folks, I'm Mike, and I hope you're well. It's really important to organize your files and folders on your system to maximize performance. It's irritating if you're in the middle of the creative process and you get lots of pops and clicks and performance issues. So in this video, I'm going to be running through the best ways to organize your files and folders on your system. I'm also going to be revealing to you the way I actually do it on my system, as well as giving you a couple of tips about the best ways to move files and folders around. Let's get started with the worst case scenario. So let's start off with the worst case scenario, only having one drive on your system. Now this may be true for those of you, especially if you're using a laptop. Often modern laptops only have one drive installed. Now I don't want to imply that you can't produce music on a one drive system, but I think that as you move on and you start to produce more data and you also get more software, you will run up against performance issues caused by the fact that you're only using one drive. Now we'll talk about how to solve that later, but I want to stick with this scenario for a moment so that we can discuss the different types of software and data that we have in use during music production. Now the first thing of course that we need on that drive is an operating system. For most of us that's going to be either Windows or a Mac system, but you may be using Linux as well. The important thing to understand about the operating system is that it's often reading and writing to this drive even when you're not doing anything, even when it's just open and you haven't got any DAW software or anything like that loaded up. You'll often find that there's little read and write operations going on with the operating system. It's important to be aware of that because that's sometimes the cause, or often the cause, of performance issues. Moving on, of course, one of the main things that we're concerned with is our applications, especially our DAW. Now, I use Cakewalk Studio One and Pro Tools as my DAWs on my system, and I also use some standalone applications associated with music production. Those could be things like, say, standalone players for like Contact, or even things like RX. I use the standalone version of Isotope's RX as well, an awesome application. So those are the kinds of things we'll have installed. And also, of course, most of us are going to have things like word processors and our web browsing software and all kinds of other things on our operating system as well. Now, these are not too problematic, actually. Most DAW applications are quite small in size. They don't take up an awful lot of space on your hard drive, and they in themselves are not sort of written to a hard drive quite often. They'll be read up front when you first load them up, and they'll be loaded into memory, and that's it. But of course, they do produce data which is being written to hard drives an awful lot. We'll discuss that in a moment. But let's move on and look at the other type of thing we often install, and that's plugins. We often tend to collect a lot of these. Now, these are not too problematic to have on one drive. They're very, very small in size normally, and they tend to be read into memory once. Some of them do produce data, but most of them don't. The only thing I want to make you aware of with plugins is there are a few standard default locations where they get installed on a system depending on their version. Depending on the version of VST 1, 2, 3, they all get installed in different places, and also whether it's a 32-bit or a 64-bit version of the plugin. It's important to understand that because you want to make sure that your DAW is looking in all of those different locations to make sure that it can actually load those plugins in, but it doesn't create any particular performance issues, so we're not going to delve into that today. Now, the next thing that we want to look at is the actual DAW projects themselves. This is the data which is produced during the recording of a song, or perhaps creating a whole EP. You may have a project file for that, or an LP, what have you. Now, these are things which are being written to all the time during the recording process, and also these are files that are being read from all the time during the playback process as well. So these are competing with the operating system already for those read-write operations on that drive. And this can definitely be a cause of some bottlenecks as you get bigger and bigger projects. Okay, it's not too bad with small projects, but as they get bigger, this can create a problem. Now, the next thing that we need to be aware of is instrument libraries or sample libraries. The issue with these can be a performance issue in terms of some of them do get read constantly as they're being used. but they're more of a space issue. These tend to take up more space than anything else as you collect more and more of them, and many of us do. Now, the problem here is it's going to start to fill up that drive quite quickly. And as a benchmark, I don't like to use, say, more than 70% of the capacity of my drive at any one time. Once I start to see it get to 70, maybe 80%, I'm definitely looking to buy new drives, especially if it's an old physical hard drive rather than something like an SSD. You don't want to overfill your drive. Just don't. Moving on from there, the last thing that I want to consider is documents. Now, documents, I perhaps wouldn't have had in this video up until a few months ago. I was always aware that they're being used by plugins, especially. A lot of presets for plugins will get stored in the documents folder. If you look at your documents folder, if you've already got your software already set up and you have a look in there, you'll generally see a lot of vendor names for plugins in there, and they're normally saving rather small files. However, a good viewer of the channel by the name of Don or Donnie pointed out to me recently that he discovered that some of his plugins that use actual instrument libraries were storing them there by default. Now, it may be something you don't notice during installation, and you start to see your hard drive fill up really, really quickly. It could be that it's your documents folder which is getting filled up quickly. Now, we'll talk about relocating that later in a separate section of this video, because especially on Windows, there's a kind of a correct way to do it, which is quite easy but worth knowing about. So that's another consideration, and that's really all of the considerations that we have during music production. So as we can see, they're problematic for OneDrive because all of these things are now competing to read and write to that drive, and that can create a bottleneck. So definitely, I would normally say to people, if you want to take music production seriously, add a second drive. Now, if you do add a second drive, how would you move these things around? What's the best way to do that? Well, for me, the first thing that I would move over to that second drive is the actual instrument libraries. Now, the reason I do that, they're not really competing so much for drive operations always. Some of them are, some of them aren't. But there's such a big space issue. They really fill up drives quickly. So I definitely would move these first onto the second drive and make sure you're not filling up that first drive. It also plays into a sort of a methodology that I have, which is separating your data from your operating system and your programs or applications. I'll delve into that a little bit later, but that's the first part of the puzzle for me. Also, I would tend to move my DAW projects over there as well. These are the things which are competing for read-write operations to your first drive. So this, for me, I would say that this would create the biggest performance increase, actually moving these across if you're having performance issues, because now your operating system can write to both drives simultaneously rather than creating a kind of a queue of read and write operations to one drive. Now, the final one that I would move over to drive 2 would be that documents folder. As I mentioned, I'll show you how to do that properly a little bit later on. Even if I didn't have a music production sort of setup going on here, on all of my computers, as soon as I've got a second drive, I always move things like my documents and my pictures and my videos away from the first drive, so that the first drive only has the operating system and applications on it mainly. One of the reasons for that is that eventually, for most of us, something goes wrong with that operating system. It gets corrupted. Something like that will happen often on Windows. Of course, it's renowned for it. And you may want to reinstall your whole system. It's a lot easier to do that if you just have to reinstall your operating system and a few applications, rather than have to back up everything from your OneDrive onto, external drives before you do the whole thing, then reinstall your operating system, then reinstall all of those things. It's much better to keep your data separate on a separate drive, which is not going to have anything to do with a reinstallation of your operating system. Now, for some of us, we can also install a third drive. Now, when you start to get to the third drive stage, you get a little bit more choices, in my opinion, depending on the size of that drive. Now, if you can afford a fairly cheap third drive, which is going to be small, then I would say use that to move your DAW projects there. That means that you've got a lot of separation in terms of read-write operations. Now, the reason you can get away with this with a smallish drive is because DAW projects don't tend to take up quite as much space as instrument libraries do, depending on your particular situation. But for most of us, those instrument libraries are going to take up a lot more space than DAW projects. So with a small third drive, you can move them there, and then you're separating a lot of these read-write operations that can happen simultaneously between the operating system, the libraries, and the DAW projects. So that's going to create a performance increase there. Now, if you can afford a much larger third drive, or even maybe a fourth drive, then in that case, what I would do is actually start saving your new instrument or sample libraries as you purchase them to that third drive. So you'll have more than one location then for your instrument libraries. I've got them here on drive 2 and 3. Those are the things that tend to expand most. Now, I've done it slightly different to this, and you'll see that in a moment when we look in detail at how I actually arrange things in real life. But one thing I want to point out about these instrument libraries as well is you do need to make sure, if you've already got them existing and you're now moving them to that third drive, you do need to make sure that you update the plugins so that they look for them in that new location. Now, that can be problematic with just a few plugins. I've got a little trick to show you a little later on in the video where you can kind of fool some plugins into thinking that their instrument libraries are still in their original location where they've actually been moved to a third location. Let's talk about that later, but first of all, let's see how I actually arrange things on my system. By the way, are you finding this video useful at all? If you are, go ahead and hit the like button for me. Do it right away so that you don't forget. If you're not finding this video useful and you absolutely hate it, go ahead and hit the dislike button twice. And if you do like this kind of content, make sure you subscribe and ring the bell so that you're notified about my other videos. Now, back to this video. So here are the actual storage places on my system. Now there's 3 different types of things that you're seeing here. First of all, at the top, we're seeing these folders. In Windows, these are kind of special folders. We're going to talk about this one, as I say later, the documents folder. But these folders can't just be sort of dragged and move anywhere on your system. You need to update your system properly so that it can recognize them being in new places. So we'll hide that so it doesn't confuse us for the moment, but we'll get back to it later. The other thing that we can see at the bottom here are these network drives. Now, you probably won't have network drives on your system. These are drives which I'm connected to with my system, but are actually on my server, which is in another part of the house. And these are largely used for backup. Okay. Now, I'm not going to cover backup in this video, but I do have a backup video coming up very, very soon, which I think is going to be very important for you guys to watch. But today we're really talking about organizing things on the actual system rather than backup. So I'll hide that for the moment. And what we're left with is the 7 drives which I have on my system. Now, these are all actually SSDs. I just find that they're so much more efficient. They work so much more quickly. And also, I have to say, I'm going to recommend this, even though I'm not being sponsored in any way, but I have tended now to go for the Samsung Evo series of SSDs. They just seem to last much, much longer, and they do read and write a little bit faster than most, if not all, of the other brands. Now, I sort of alluded there to the fact that it may fail at times. SSDs do fail, guys. They don't last forever. Just like old hard drives, they can fail. So it's worth buying something which is going to last a little bit longer. And as I say, you should have a backup solution in place as well, which we will discuss in that other video. Now, apart from mentioning that these are all SSDs, I also want to mention that 2 of these drives are not really used in my music production at all. So the first one here is, I call it main data here. This just has all kinds of other files, you know, my Word documents, graphics that I create and save, all that kind of stuff on that drive there. So nothing to do with my music production is actually there. The other kind of drive that I have on my system is this one, which I call a scratch disk. This is only used in my video editing. It's just a temporary file space for my video editor software to store its things. So you don't really need to think about these 2 drives here, the G and the H drives. The other 5 drives that I have there are all to do with music production. So starting off with that C drive, of course, I have my operating system, and I store my DAW, my plugins, and other sort of music applications all there. I don't keep any of my data to do with music on there at all. Now, the other places are all mostly filled up with libraries. I have to say, I collect a lot of libraries. They take up a lot of space. So my D drive here, which I call Audio 1, this is almost all libraries, and you'll recognize some of the vendor names there. So those are places where I store my sample libraries. Also in Audio 2 here, I store libraries there as well. A lot more there, taking up a lot more space. Again, that's on a 2 terabyte drive, and look how full it is. Gonna need to do something about that soonish. I'm going to then take a look at Drive I. I'm skipping over F for the moment. Drive I also has a library there, or some libraries, and these are east-west libraries. Gives you a little bit of a clue about a review I'm going to be doing in the very, very near future. I've had to install some of their libraries, and I had to buy a whole new SSD to do that because they take up lots of space. They're very good, by the way, but wait for the video to learn about that. So the last place that I want to mention is this one, my F drive. That's where I store my projects. I've got my Cakewalk and my Studio One projects there. I do actually produce some Pro Tools projects, but they're very, very small. I don't use it all that often, so I don't actually bother to put these here. But if I started to use Pro Tools a lot, then I would definitely store my projects on this drive as well, just to keep them separate from everything else. So that's how my system works. That's the amount of space I need. You can see I've got a 1 terabyte one there, 1 terabyte one there, 2 terabytes, 1 terabyte, half a terabyte, 220 something gigabytes there on that one, and another 2 terabyte one which I've just added. So the next thing that I want to discuss with you, of course, is how to move that documents folder easily and safely. So as I say, it's desirable to have your documents folder off of your main C drive in Windows and onto another drive. And there's a kind of proper way of doing that which will stop your system getting too confused. So the first thing that you want to do is actually create a new folder in the place where you want documents to be. Now I have it here on my main data drive, my G drive, and I created a folder called Documents. Now when you first create it, it's going to have the regular yellow icon that you normally see with folders. I've finished this process, so the system changed the icon, but do be aware that it will have the regular icon. Now I tend to stick with calling it Documents, but I think you can call it a different name if you want, but it's probably safest to leave it as being called Documents. Now if we go back to this view, then the next thing you need to do is find the current Documents shortcut there in Windows, right click on it, and then click on Properties. Now that's going to bring up this window here, and that has a tab called Location. So if you click on that, then you need to click on the Move button here. That's going to allow you to select a new folder, and that you're going to have to find that folder that you've just created. So I would go in and select that folder. Now I'm not going to complete the process here because I've already done it, but if you click Select Folder, it's then going to ask you if you want to move all the current data from the original location of Documents to the new one. And generally I'd say I would click yes for that unless you have some special reason not to. Once you've done that, then whenever any application or program is looking for that documents folder, it will find it in the correct place. And as we say some of the plugins actually create presets and things there, so it will find the correct place to put them, and it won't be on your C drive any longer, which will be a good thing. So most plugins that use libraries will have a feature where you can relocate that library, or if after you've relocated it, you can point that plugin in its settings to the correct library, and always use that way of doing things if you can. However, once in a while I've come across a plugin which doesn't have that feature. It has a kind of default place where it saves it on the C drive and you can't change it, and that can be a problem because it can take up precious space on your C drive. So I'm going to show you a kind of a hack for that now, which I want you to proceed with carefully. I'm going to show you the careful way of doing it, which in my experience has worked around about 99% of the time. I think I had one occasion where it didn't work. So the way we do it is this. I've got this drum library over here, which is on my C drive. This is faked up, so there's actually nothing in there, but let's pretend it's real. And that's sitting on that C drive where I don't want it. I want to have it over here on my D drive, okay? So the first thing I'm going to do is actually copy that across. So I'll just right click on copy, and then paste it across. It's important for safety's sake that you do copy it rather than cut it at the moment. Okay, so it's done that, and we've actually got our library over in that new location, but we've still got this old one in the old location. Now, just in case things don't work out, we're going to go ahead and rename this. I generally just throw something like an X character on the end there so I can show it's the X library. Now, the plugin will no longer find its library. If you run the plugin at the moment, it will probably show some kind of error. We need to fool the plugin into finding this library in its old place. And the way we're going to do that is by creating a shortcut. So I'll just right click here, click on New, and click on Shortcut. In this dialog box, I will select the folder where I copied the library to. So that was on my D drive, if you remember, and that's called Drum Library, and I'll select that. And I'm going to keep the name and everything the same. So when you go click on next, you've got this option to change the name. Don't change it, keep it the same. Okay, it needs to be the exact same name as the folder was originally called. So what happens now, as I say, 99% of cases, is when the plugin goes looking for the library, it finds the shortcut here, which it thinks is the actual library, and it starts to read from there absolutely fine. Now it's actually getting it from its new location, which in this case is in the D drive. So normally once I've got that set up, I will give it a try, just make sure it's working. And then once I'm happy, I'll just go ahead and delete that original folder like so. And I'll have saved myself a whole heap of space on my C drive, as well as avoiding lots of read-write operations on my C drive as well. So what this video hasn't been is a solution for backing up data, and you should have a solution for backing up data. Now I'm going to be covering that very soon on the channel, so please stay tuned for that. Now if you found any of this confusing at all, please do ask in the comments down below. And if you've got some other tips to share in order to help other people make their system perform better, then please do share them in the comments down below as well. Now check out the description for my link to my patreon.com, where for as little as $1 per month, you can help me help you by making more videos like this. And I'll see you in the next video.